this is part 2 of the Cube Destroyer Lab tutorial. Hopefully you've done everything in part 1 and you're ready to move along. Part 1, we spent the time setting up our project so that everything we have left to do is mostly just the programming. A lot of students seem to have issues on how to approach this. How do we take this giant looking lab right up? If I pull it up real fast, this looks like a lot of stuff, and it can be kind of overwhelming when you see this. Where am I supposed to start? How am I supposed to do this? So we did kind of the first part, set up the project with everything that you know how to do, so that we can just focus on the scripts now. Everything else is done. We just have to worry about our game controller script and our cube color script. And we've already even started the game controller script a little bit. We set up all of our variables here at the top, and we have our button events ready to go. And we have the controller script hooked up inside of Unity already, and you should have your quit button and your next level button already set up as well. So we just really have to worry about our start and update events and all of the other functions that we need to write, and those are listed down here. So a good way to start this is just to kind of get all of your thoughts in order. And this is why we have you guys do flowcharts. And I did start to flowchart this lab, and I know it's not required for the labs to do flowcharts, like you don't have to hand them in, but doing partial flowcharts or whole flowcharts can be very helpful if you're trying to approach this on your own. So if you need to do that, like, do it, even if it's just scribbling some notes down on some paper. So here is my flowchart, and we're going to kind of go over some of this. I'll show you, what some of this stuff means, because it's also a good example of how to flowchart certain things. But the first thing I did was up here at the top is I listed out all of the functions that I need to have for this lab. I also made a list of all the class level variables, public and private, that I need. So looking at the functions, those are just listed here in the assignment. And I just started with the first one. It's create gameplay. And this is a void method with no parameters. So that's very easy to write. I'm just going to let's see if I can kind of juggle these a little bit so we can have both on the screen at the same time. Squish this up. And put this right here. So right here, void, create gameplay, and just the parentheses because there's no parameters passed to it. And next one is create ground. And if you read this, we find this is another void. We're not sending anything back with no parameters. So I wrote that in. Void, create ground with parentheses. The next one, pick random color. This one returns a color. So we know it's not going to be a void, but it also has no parameters as well. So I wrote that out, color, pick random color with the parentheses. And you just kind of keep on doing this until you get through all of them. The other one I do want to kind of note is the generate cube one. This is a void one, but it does have 2 ints passed to it. And this one is for when a single cube is created, and the 2 ints passed for it is the position of the cube. Since this is Unity, we know that it's going to be an X position and a Z position. So when I wrote out this one, void, generate cube, and inside the parentheses, I started to name what these parameters are going to be. Int X and int Z, since it's going to be for position. And this is a good way to get started, so you can kind of get your thoughts in order. We can kind of figure out exactly what we need. And then the nice thing about this is after we have this listed, I don't really want to have to type these up again. I already figured out what I needed. I don't want to have to type these up in Visual Studio. So I can come in, and if I highlight them, I can right click, copy, go to my game controller script, and underneath my events, I'm just going to hit Control V and just paste those all in, because I already figured these out. I don't want to type them again. I just need to take a couple minutes to kind of clean them up a little bit because you can see we're getting some errors. But these are really easy to fix. So for create gameplay, we just need to put in the curly braces. And let's tab this one over as well. Put in our curly braces. Get this one tabbed over. Curly braces. And even though we put the curly braces in this one, we're still getting an error for this one. And we didn't get errors for these, but we're getting an error for this one. And the difference is this is a void function, and this is a value returning function. And if you're using Visual Studio, it's going to error because this function is it's expecting you to return something, and you haven't returned something. So that's why it's giving this error. So what I usually do when I'm writing stuff is I'll even put a little comment here about this is just going to be a temporary. And I'm just going to do a quick return of, since it needs to be a color, we'll just do color.red, just so that we can make sure this isn't erroring anymore. We want to make sure that we are keeping no errors in here, so that when we do a little bit of work, we can pop back over to Unity, have this reloaded into Unity, and test out some stuff. So we want to make sure that we're getting rid of all of these problems. So let's fix up these. And we'll do this one. Do this one. And this is going to be another value returning function. It's not a void function. This one is returning a string. So we can just do a temporary one again. So return, and we'll just send it a string that says temp in it, so that we no longer have an error going on. We just have to, obviously it says temp, so this is a good signal to us that this isn't meant to be here. We have to change this at some point. So we'll do this, and we should not have any other squiggly lines. And the nice thing too is we have all of our functions ready to go. We just have to fill in the code now. And now that we have kind of our functions figured out and we kind of know what they need to do, I would also recommend coming in here, and the information in here is good enough that we could just, for instance, take the create gameplay, and we could just use this as our comments for all of these. If you wanted to take the time to kind of come in here and paste these in, so that we can remember what we're supposed to do with these, because we don't always want to be jumping back and forth between Blackboard. We don't want a million windows open and get confused. So this will be a nice way to have this all in Visual Studio for us. And it just takes a minute. Just a couple more. And this will also give you the opportunity, while you're doing this, you should be reading these so you have an idea of what these functions are meant to do. So you can start to piece them together in your mind of where they kind of belong in the program. So we only have 2 events, and these 2 events will have to call all of these functions in some way. Maybe some of these functions are nested inside of other functions, but we only have the start event and the update event. And we're going to use the start event to kind of initialize the game. So we have to think about, what do we need to start this game? And this update event is, what do we need to be checking every single time, like 30 to 60 frames a second. What should we be checking for? So let's kind of start to fill in what should happen in our start. And our start, we really don't want to have too much code in here. We really don't want to keep this too cluttered. We should just kind of keep this for just initializing things to begin the game. And if you kind of read through all of the methods or functions, whichever you prefer to call them, we have one called create gameplay. And I'm going to kind of move this here so we can kind of look at the list of functions here as we type in some code. Let's kind of resize this a little bit because this will be a good way to kind of figure out where stuff needs to go. So create gameplay, and if we go look at that, it's meant to set up the game into its start position. And that sounds like exactly what we need to do in our start. So in our start event, let's call that function. So we'll write create gameplay. And we don't need to send it any parameters, but we still have to put the parentheses in and our semicolon. There's one more thing we have to do in our start. And we have to make sure that we are setting our UI to its start position. Because if you remember, this is what it looks like when we start the game. It's going to look like this. And we don't need to see our win screen yet. Cubes is fine, quit is fine. But we don't want to see this aspect of our UI. So we need to make sure that we are hiding that when we start. I guess you could probably set it inside of here. If we go to the panel, you could hide it. But it's kind of nice to make sure that we are setting that to hide in our start code, just in case something happens. Like if you're working on a group project and you have it set to be hidden initially, and you don't do it in your start code, what if someone else comes along behind you and accidentally turns it on? And it will then be visible when the game starts. So if we make sure in our start event to set that panel, and that's why right here we have it right here. We have access to it. So we're going to say win panel dot set active to false, just to 100% make sure that we can't see our win panel when the game starts. And that's everything that we need in our start. We initialize our board, and we make sure we can't see our win conditions. So let's go down to the update. What are some things that we need to check every single time? And if you did the raycasting video like you should before you do this, one of them should be familiar. And that is, we should be checking, let me pull this up. We should be checking for our clicks. And this is the same thing that we did in the raycasting demo, is we are checking to see if the left mouse button is clicked. And if it's clicked, we're going to check to see what it's clicked on. So we'll call check for clicks in our update. So this is where we'll check to see if one of our cubes was clicked on. And in that code, we'll also, if it's clicked on, we'll destroy it and we'll update our game text for our count and everything. So after we're checking for clicks, we have one more thing we have to check. So we're going to check to see if a box was clicked on, and after that, we need to check for win. Check for win is our function that we can call where the game checks to see if we are out of cubes. Did we destroy all of our cubes? So update, we're going to first check to see if a box was clicked on. If it is, it's going to get destroyed. And then after we check for that, we'll check to see if our win condition has been met yet. And if it has, we'll display our win message. And that's all that we need to put in these two. They're nice and clean. All of our other coding is going to be done inside of our functions. So now that we have this ready to go, and if you need to pause the video and kind of get up to this point, I would recommend making sure you're caught up. All of these are pasted in. You have all of your directions in there, and you have these all set up and ready to go. because the next we're just going to actually program the gameplay now. And before we do that, though, I do want to kind of figure out what do all these functions need to do. And the best way to do that is to kind of do a flow chart. And this will also be kind of a good example of how to use flowcharts for doing functions. Because I know before this course we've just done really simple flowcharts, and we can kind of show a little bit more complex flowcharts with this. So the first one we're going to do is our create gameplay flowchart. And this one is really simple, because if we read the directions for that, it says it's just responsible for setting up the game into its start position. So if we kind of look at all of the functions we have, maybe should we potentially set them all, do all our coding in here? But if you notice, we have a function called create ground. And this function is meant to access the ground object in the scene and set its color to random, which is what we need to do at the start of gameplay. So rather than putting the code in there, we'll just call that function, and we can kind of say this is a good way to show that we're calling this function called create ground. And we typed it in here. The next thing we need to do to start the game is we need to have all of the cubes created and randomly placed. And if you look at the list of functions, rather than doing all that code inside create gameplay, it was split off into its own function called create all cubes. And we got that right there. And so we're just going to call the create all cubes function. Another aspect of gameplay that we can't forget about is we need to display how many cubes are left in the game. And we didn't know that until we created all of our cubes. So we need to make sure that we are outputting to that text how many cubes there are. And we do have this nice function called print cube count that we can call every single time we want to change how many cubes there are, because it is a value returning function, and it returns a string that should have like a nice string that says cube and how many cubes are left. So we can say the output is going to be, we're going to use that print cube count for that output. And that should be it. That's all we really need to do to set up our game board. So that's a pretty simple one to do. So if we want to take the time to do our code, we could jump back to Visual Studio, find our create gameplay, and while looking at our flowchart, we can easily type this in. This isn't actually going to be a very long one. We have to call that create ground function. So create ground. Nothing sent to it. We have to create all the cubes. And nothing is sent to that one. And we have to change the text using that print cube count function. And if you remember, this is a value returning function. So we do know where the text is. We're bringing that in. It's that count text right here. That's what's supposed to hold it. And it's okay that we haven't done this yet. Remember, we have that dummy text being spit out. So this compiles, so this is fine. That's why we kind of took the time to make sure that all of these didn't have any errors. So as we type stuff in, we can, check on stuff as we go. So we're going to say count text. Dot text is equal to print cube count, because remember, it's going to return a string. So remember, for the value returning functions, we need something that's going to catch what it is returning. So this is going to spit out a string, and this text is going to catch it, and that string is going to go into this text on the count text. And that's all it is for create gameplay. That was a pretty easy one. So let's move on. Let's do our create ground. And I have done the flowchart for this one too. And this one's pretty pretty easy as well. So we're going to start. We're going to then, if we read the directions, we're supposed to randomly change the color of the ground. And we have a nice function here called pick random color that is going to return a color for us. So we just have to call that pick random color function, and remember that it does return a color. So we just kind of have this in here just so we know what's going on. We need to grab the ground renderer because that's how we can change the color. And when we get to this in code, I'll go into a little bit more detail on how this works. But we need to input the ground renderer from here because it's not actually inside the code. We have to grab it from out. So we might as well just call this an input. It works pretty well for that. And then we're going to output to the ground this random color. We're going to change it. This works pretty well. If you wanted to just kind of do it as like a square, just saying like the ground color changes, that's fine. There isn't like a 100%. For this course, we're not like 100% following a strict flowchart guideline. As long as it's easy to follow and you could give this to somebody else and they would know exactly what to do with this. And once we change the ground color, that's it. That's the end of it. So let's then work on the program for this one. We can go over to our code, create ground, and let's look at our flowchart. Oops, I'm making a mess here. There we go. Create ground. No, not that. Let's try to get that back up. There it is. So create ground. We need to call that pick random color function. But remember, this returns a color. And like I said, value returning functions, you need to have something to catch what it's returning. So we're going to make a new color variable. We're just going to call it, we have to say color, random color. This is kind of like when you create a string, you do a string and give it a name is equal to, or an int, give it a name is equal to. We're going to do color, random color is equal to pick random color. Because remember, this is going to spit out a random color. And this variable here, this color variable, is going to catch that so that we know what it is. If we don't do this, because you can just do this, we won't get an error if we just did this. See, it doesn't squiggle. You just have to kind of remember to do that, because all this does then is it will run. A random color will be picked. It will then return a color, but there's nothing here to catch it. So it's just kind of spit into the ether of the program, never to be seen again. So it's kind of like this doesn't really do anything. So make sure you do have a color variable to catch that. So once we have our color, we then need to grab the renderer of the ground. This is something that we did feed into it. It's this public game object ground. And to grab it, we type this in. And I will explain this in a little bit more detail after I type it. So let's type this all out, and then I'll go into what this actually means. So we're going to make a renderer object called ground rend. And that's going to be equal to, so this is a new variable. It's a renderer object. And this is equal to our ground dot get component. And we have to use the get component that has the less than, greater than signs on it. Because inside of there, we need to type renderer. And this is how we can access the renderer on the ground. And this makes some sense if you kind of take a look at this ground object inside of Unity. And we're going to do that in a second after I type the next line of code so that we can kind of look at a bunch of aspects of our ground inside of Unity. We're going to say ground rend, which is this. This is accessing the renderer of the ground. Dot material dot color is equal to random color. Oops. Random color. There we go. Remember, this is that random color we got from the pick random color. So ground rend.material.color and this renderer and this get component. Like, what is this all? Where does this come from? So if we pop back over to Unity for a second and we click on our ground and we look at it inside the inspector, these are all of the components of our ground. So you can get component, you can get a lot of different things. And if you're curious, we can go to the Unity API and let's look for get component. Let's see, game object.get component. This is what we're using because these are game objects. And this just kind of talks about it. And there's a lot of different components we can get from our game object. If we go to game object, let's see. Oops, let's go back to the get component. This is where you could start to find all this stuff because there's a lot of different components to this. So if we go back, let's talk about the transform, the mesh collider, the mesh renderer, and this is actually what we're grabbing because remember, it's the renderer. That's what this means. So grab the renderer of this. So this is the renderer. Look at the dot material dot color. So in the renderer, we're looking at this material and we're looking at the color. So if we go to, if we kind of like look at this material, this is what we're changing right here. See this color? Color right here. So you can access these, like these properties in here. These are accessible. But we're just changing the color. But keep in mind that you could do a lot of stuff in your code to change things like your materials. You just have to access them through the renderer. And this is all we have to do to change our ground color. So one more thing we're going to do in this part of the video is we are going to do our pick random color. Because after we do this random color part, we can test this and make sure that our gameplay is getting created correctly. We're not going to create all cubes yet, but the ground is going to be created and we are going to change it to a random color. So let's take a look at our flowchart for this one, because I did do also a flowchart for this one. This one's a little bit more intense because we are going to use a switch to pick our color. This is the way this is supposed to work. If you read the directions for it, is it's a method that returns a color and has no parameters. It chooses one of 5 possible colors and returns it to where the method was called from. So we have to pick randomly 1 through 5. So like most things in programming, if we have to randomly choose something, we're going to use a random number generator between 1 and 5. We're going to take that number and throw it into a switch. So this is how you actually do a switch in a flowchart. You have the box that's a switch, and what you're going to be checking, what cases, what's going to be the case thing that we're checking, and we're going to be checking this number that we made. Case, if the number is 1, we're going to set it to color.red. Case 2, color.green. Case 3, color.blue. Case 4, color.magenta. Case 5, color.yellow, and we always should have a default. If for some reason, and this should never happen, but you should always do a default case just in case something breaks. This is a great way to help find bugs in your code, because if something ever does end up the default, even though it should never happen, you know that there's a problem somewhere, and you could it's easier to kind of figure out where stuff's supposed to go. So we're going to set it to gray if we don't get 1 through 5, because that's our, oh no, something went wrong color. And that's all we have to do. We just have to return the color afterwards. So let's talk about the code for this. We'll jump back over to here and pick random color. We do have this temporary one right here, but we can start filling this in now. So the first thing we need to do, if we're returning something, sometimes it's just easier at the top since we're returning a color. Let's make a new color variable called, it'll be color return color. And this is going to be the color that we end up returning. So we can kind of get rid of this temporary one now and just say return color. And it is going to yell at us, but that's okay. It's just because we haven't actually put anything in here yet, but we're going to do that in a second. So this is fine. So if it get an error, that's okay. We now need to have a random number chosen. So we're going to say int random number, and we're going to call that random number generator, which is just random.range. And we want to do 1 through 5. And since this is an integer, if you kind of remember, our first number in here is going to be 1 because we want to start at 1. But we're actually going to have 6 be our last one for the range. Because if you remember, the way this random number generator works is it does 1 and up to, but not including 6. Since this is an integer, that means 1 through 5. If this was going to be a double or a float, it would mean it would be 1 through 5.9999, etc., but not 6. So since we want 1 through 5, we want this to be actually 1, 6. And that should just be review. Hopefully you knew that already. Next, we need to write our switch statement. So we're going to do switch random number and then we'll do all of our cases. And I kind of like to, I don't want to type more stuff than I need to, so I kind of do it where I write my first case. I'm going to do case 1. That return color is going to be set to color.red. And then once that's set, we're going to break out of that switch. I do need to do 4 more and then our default, but I am just going to highlight this, Control C to copy it, and paste in 5 more. So case 1, case 2, 3, 4, 5, and our default. And I'm just going to come in and make sure I change all of these to the correct information. And this just gets changed to default. So case 2, we're going to change it to green. Case 3, we're going to change it to blue. Case 4, we're going to change this to magenta. Case 5, we're going to change this to yellow. And the default color is going to be gray. So this we should never see a gray ground plane or gray color anywhere, because we're actually going to use this to color our cubes as well. But if you see gray, you know something went wrong with this. And we already changed that return value. So that's actually all we need to do for our pick random color. That's it. It's not too bad. And now that we have this, and since we made sure to go that this is all okay, we can test out our code. This is a good time to stop and check to make sure that our ground is changing randomly. This also make sure that everything else is hooked up. Cubes, since we did put that temporary code in, should be changing to temp. This should disappear when we hit play, and this board will be changing colors. So let's hit play. and we have a yellow board. Yeah, if you are not aware, this is just a setting I use to make sure that I know I'm in play, so I don't forget to go out of play when I'm done with it. So let's hit play again. So it was yellow that time. We'll hit play. We have a red ground this time. We hit play. Yellow again. Yellow again. Red again. Let's try to get at least one more color. Oh, and magenta. It is good to make sure you test it a bunch of times that you are getting all the colors. Sometimes random isn't quite random. You will get like a whole bunch of the same color in the row. That's fine. But make sure you are to this point. So we have a good amount done. We have our create gameplay, create ground, pick random color. So all we have left to do is generate our cubes, check for clicks, which we've done before. So we're actually just going to copy and paste the code from the raycasting demonstration we did in the previous video, and just kind of clean it up so that it fits for this. And then just checking for our win and making sure that our print cube count is done correctly. So make sure you're at this point, make sure everything is working. If you need to rewind stuff, go back and look at stuff. Get to this point where everything functions before you start the next video.